Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Champalimaud Center for the Unknown. Tonight's event is going to be on the path of happiness, peace, or pleasure. My name is Nuno Loureiro. I'm a PhD student here at the Champalimaud Neuroscience program. And tonight, we're going to be dealing with a question that at the first glance might seem very easy to answer. What is happiness? Well, is it joy? Is it comfort? Is it maybe some momentary thing, or maybe something a little bit more long-lasting? Well, last weekend, we took to the streets of Lisbon, and we asked people the exact same question: what is happiness? And as you will see, many people were not able to come up with an answer straight away. Let's look at it.
What is the question?
Happiness, it's I don't know.
It's a difficult question.
O que é felicidade para mim? Eu acho que a felicidade para mim, happiness is
Happiness is just
Happiness is
So as you see, even though it may appear an easy question, it is definitely not very easy to answer. And so I think a good way of starting this evening is actually to look inside. And what I would like to do is to give you an example of what happiness is for me and what makes me happy. And I would like to do this by telling you a short story. So I was a competitive swimmer for many years. And being a competitive swimmer means that many times you have to wake up quite early, like 5:30 in the morning, and you're sleepy and tired, but still you force yourself out of bed and you drive through the night in order to go to the closest swimming pool, where you throw yourself into cold waters so that before the sun rises, you have already done more than 3 kilometers. So by the end of the practice, of course, you're exhausted. And not only that, but you know that ahead of you, there's still a full day of classes and another evening practice that is going to be longer and even more exhausting than the one that you had in the morning. All this before you can go back home, have dinner, and pass out in bed, knowing that the next day is going to be exactly the same. So, of course, I understand that this may not be true for most of you. This may not seem like something that would make you happy. And so what I would like you to do now is to take a few moments and actually talk with your neighbors and discuss what makes you happy. So please go ahead, do take a moment and ask your neighbor what you think makes you happy and try to come to a conclusion to see if you succeed in this better than the people I just showed. Okay, so let me try to interrupt you for a moment. Was it easy? Please raise your hands if you did reach a conclusion on what happiness is for you. Or if you agreed with what your neighbor said that happiness was for them. Well, after this brief moment where people didn't really come up with an answer for what happiness is, they did have some opinions. And so let's play the video again on what happened afterwards.
Tocar, CD, a música é uma das coisas que mais me faz feliz. I guess being around with friends, having a good meal, listening to music.
Bom sexo. Me faz feliz.
It makes me happy personally when I speak with people, when I discover that I have things in common with other persons.
Acordar de manhã, tomar aquele café, aquele pão com presunto já é o herói do meu dia. Daí veio tocar com meus amigos. É isso para mim, felicidade.
E viver desta cidade, viver este sol maravilhoso.
Creating things, especially when you can do it with somebody else. So.
Be a good croissant, it can be seeing your sports teams win, being with the girl you love, or with your friends having a drink.
As crianças é uma coisa mágica
mesmo, me faz feliz. Quando passa uma criança aqui e vem, dança e canta, ou elas estão aqui comigo, eu já fico mais feliz.
Happiness is to be able to share your joy.
Being yourself and doing what you love.
Sometimes happiness you laughing, and sometimes it's just you proud of, you smile and say, I did it.
Can't get pleasure or happiness without working for it. So.
Acho que a felicidade é você ter harmonia no tudo que faz.
Mais que felicidade, muitas pessoas confundem isso com felicidade. É a paz interior, que eu não sei explicar.
Happiness, you can't really search for it, it's just like happening to you.
Felicidade e prazer acabam sendo sinônimos. É.
But they are not the same. You can be happy without pleasure.
Happiness is just the way I want to be.
Well, so as you see, people do come up with an answer. They do have an opinion of what happiness is. But many times, and for many people, happiness means something different, right? So, of course, this is not a new question. And many people around the world have tried to give some thought into this question. And if you take, for example, one of the greatest Greek philosophers, and actually one of the first people to actually write about happiness, Aristotle observed around him that many people would try or strive for increasing their wealth, their pleasure, or their honor, but they would never do this because of the things themselves. They would do this because they thought that these things would make them happier. In fact, Aristotle concluded that happiness is the meaning and the purpose of life, is the whole aim and end of human existence. So in other words, what Aristotle is telling us is that happiness is the goal of our goals. So coming back to today and going in time more than 2,000 years, do we agree with this? Well, at least it seems that some sectors seem to agree. So the advertising sector is always telling us to buy their products because it's going to make them happy, being it with chewing gum, self-assembly furniture, or for example, this creamy chocolate that you can spread in your bread, right? And many other things, of course. So everywhere you look around, you're going to find happiness. But so, of course, we are kind of joking here because Aristotle wouldn't think that buying these products would make you happy. In fact, in his opinion, you would have to live a moral, virtuous life in order to achieve happiness. In fact, you would have to engage in stimulating conversations so that, or he thought this could be a path to happiness. So, of course, measuring stimulating conversations may not be very easy. So one thing that we can do, for example, and one thing we can think about is, does, for example, money buy us happiness? So in order to study this relationship between money and happiness, this group from Princeton University published a paper in 2010 where they asked people if they were happy, and they asked this in a way by asking this specific question. Did you experience happiness, enjoyment, smiling, or laughter the day before this question was made? And then they asked also how much money did their family make per year. So in this case, what I'm showing you here is a logarithmic scale. So notice that from each tick, you double the amount of income. And so what they found out was that as the income would increase, so as people would get more and more money, they would report being more, or more people would report being happy. However, this was only true until a certain value. After the value of $75,000, they actually found that more money did not mean that more people will report happiness. So why $75,000? What is magical about this number? Well, it turns out that this is around the amount that you need to consider yourself living a safe and secure life. So is this the end? So can we conclude that money does buy happiness until a certain point, but not from there? Well, it turns out, as I said in the beginning, happiness is not something very easy to define, and certainly is not something easy to measure. And so it turns out that if you ask a slightly different question, you can come up with very different answers. So let's look at another study, for example. So in this case, this group also tried to study the relationship between happiness and the amount of money that people earned. But on this case, people were asked instead to evaluate their life satisfaction as if they were standing on a ladder, where 0 would be the worst possible life, and 10 would be the best possible life at that time. So they then went to average all the responses on life satisfaction for each country, and they tried to establish a relationship with this amount and the amount of money that each person in that country earns, or the GDP per capita. And what they found out was that, indeed, as the GDP would increase, so would the life satisfaction, or the reports on life satisfaction. Well, in other words, you can say, or you can see that most of the countries would lie along this red line. However, of course, if you look at this figure, there are some notable exceptions. Let's take, for example, the case of Portugal and Spain. Even though this study predicted that Portugal and Spain would lie very close together in the line, it turns out that they are quite further apart. And so Portuguese reports a lower life satisfaction than the Spanish. Well, but I guess for most of the Portuguese here in the audience, this doesn't come as a surprise, because I guess you've heard that we Portuguese tend to be a very pessimistic people, right? So what exactly then can we say about happiness? Is it just, can we just study the relationship between the amount of money that you earn and how happy you will be? Well, actually, we can look at this from a slightly different angle as well. Let's imagine, for example, that it's not the amount of money that you earn, but actually the way you spend this money that can bring you happiness. So another study that was published earlier this year, they tried to evaluate exactly this. So how does the way that you spend your money relates to the happiness or to the way that you feel about the money that you spend? So they asked some people to think about a purchase that they had just done or that they were going to do, and they asked them to think of it as being a material purchase or an experience purchase. So, for example, imagine, for example, a watch or some vacation. And so they did 2 questions. The first question was, how much do you feel this purchase will increase or has increased your overall life satisfaction? So in other words, has this made you happier? So what they saw was that people were quite good at predicting that material goods would have a lower impact in their life satisfaction. And so here you can see in blue the material goods, in green you can see the experiences, and you see they were actually good at predicting how much life satisfaction, or for how much the life satisfaction would increase with this purchase. So far so good, but what if these guys would change the question slightly? So in this case, for example, they also asked people, how do you feel that your money was spent? So do you feel it was well spent? Or if it was in the future, do you think it will be well spent? So here they found something a bit different. So if you look at this plot, what you see is that people predicted that the material purchase would have a much higher economic value than actually the experience would. But when they asked the people to come back and to report on the purchase, what they found out was that now people would report the experiences to have a higher economic value than the material goods. And so what this tells us is that it's very difficult to actually measure happiness, and it may relate to many different things. But despite this, of course, throughout the years, we've tried to reach or to find a way of reaching happiness. And many theories have come up. And what is it then exactly? What is happiness? Is what I told you, like just pushing yourself to the limit, going to your morning practice at 6 a.m.? Or maybe for you is instead this delicious smell of coffee in the morning that when you wake up and you feel that your girlfriend has just prepared the breakfast for you. Or maybe on the other end is just spending some valuable time with your friends or just living a contented life. Well, while I was preparing this talk, I actually came across a theory that I related quite strongly with. And maybe for those of you here in the crowd, if you swim or if you have practiced any other sports, or maybe if you just play an instrument and you play it for hours and hours like the violin, or you maybe just like to work and you like to work a lot and you stay late nights or you go to work during the weekend. Well, maybe this theory can also relate quite well to you. So you see, this theory is called the flow, and it was proposed by a Hungarian psychologist with an awful name called Csikszentmihalyi. But so, this psychologist, what he predicted was the following, and I will try to demonstrate this with this simple figure. So here, for example, on one side, you have your skills or your abilities, and on another side, you have your goals or your challenges. So what the psychologist tells us is that when you're able to balance your skills and your goals, when you're able to actually perfectly balance these skills and goals and you're engaged in a certain task, then you reach a state of happiness, and this may be a path, or you reach a state of flow, and this may be a path to happiness. So let me try to exemplify this by going back to the story that I told you in the beginning. So as I said, I was a swimmer, but of course I started as a little guy, and I started quite young, and of course at that time I didn't know how to swim, but the challenges that were set for myself were also not very high. Perhaps I just needed to stay afloat in the water or just swim to the other side of the swimming pool. But of course, as I got better in swimming, my coaches also demanded more and more from me. For example, you demand for me to swim longer laps or longer distances and to swim faster times. So far, so good. But what would have happened if I didn't have a coach or if I didn't push myself harder than in the beginning? Well, then, most probably, I would be lying in this zone of the figure. So you see, if I didn't push myself hard, maybe I would increase my skills, but I would not update my goals. And so I would probably be bored because it was too easy. But on the other end, we can also say, if you would push me to the swimming pool now that I haven't swum for many, many years, let's say if you push me to the swimming pool, but you don't update my goals. So you still say, try to do exactly the same times that you did before. Well, for sure, I'm not going to be able to do it. And so I will lie here on this side of the plot. The goals will be too high, and I will get frustrated, and I'll get anxious. So again, what this psychologist says, or what he proposes, is that when you balance the skills and you balance your goals, then you lie in this flow state, and this may be a path to happiness. But again, this is just one example. This is just one path, and this, as I said, one path that I relate quite strongly with, but there may be many paths. And so tonight, we're going to have two speakers, and the first speaker, Dr. Morten Kringelbach, is coming from Oxford University, from the UK, and he's going to be talking to us about the neuroscience of pleasure. And then, Scott Rennie, our very own PhD student from the Champalimaud Neuroscience program, is going to be talking about meditation and how it can affect your brain and lead you to happiness. So, what we hope to achieve here is that we are able to make you think about happiness and how it arises in the brain, and that there may be many paths, and not only the ones that we're going to be talking about here today. In fact, many of the paths that we're going to be talking about, they may seem very different at first, but they may converge in the end. And so we hope to inspire you into thinking about happiness in new and interesting ways. And so I'd like you... Thank you very much, Anna.